All right, just a recap. So, I believe that my heat exchanger has failed. And the way I deduced this was this spring when I went to commission the engine, uh, the expansion tank was dry. And I thought that was curious since I always have coolant in there, but figured, well, things settle out over the winter, no big deal. Filled it back up to the line, um, and ran the engine for an hour, ran great, no issues. But the next day when I came out to the boat, the coolant had dropped. And it had dropped, it's dropped even more, but it had dropped, let's say half an inch on here, which said, that's strange. So I brought out some test equipment that I have because I've had a lot of issues with this engine. And these are one of the greatest little tools. This is a Stant coolant pressure tester. And you basically cap that on your exhaust manifold there and pump it up to whatever pressure that you need. In my case, my cap is rated at 13 psi, so I pumped up to 13 psi. And I'd done this test 2 years ago, and it stayed there for like an hour and never moved. This year, however, it was dropping. Not a lot, but it was definitely dropping enough that I said I need to do some further inspection. Alright, well, here's the first clue. When I went and drained the heat exchanger, a bunch of very pale green liquid came out, which just so happens to be the color of my antifreeze. So now I'm enjoying trying to pull off hoses. Brought out the heat gun for that, but so far it doesn't look good. See what happens. Well, through the miracle of time travel, I wasn't able to get that on, and with Corona you can't get anything anyways, so dug through the parts bin. I got this 1/4 inch stainless street elbow. I don't even know that's not stainless, it's like galvanized. A little bit more concerning and wondering why I'm even bothering with this is, since I've done this, that coolant has dropped and this continues to drip, which leads me to believe that just the static head pressure of the coolant on the coolant side of the heat exchanger is leaking through a hole and just continuing to drip out of here, because it's a steady drip. I mean, it should have been dry by now, but we'll keep going. I managed to get the hose off this, which fought me tremendously, and the one on the back side is pretty easy. So I'll keep going. Won't be long, and I'll hook up this street elbow, and hopefully I can get my contraption working. Alright, so do some more bloody knuckles and everything else. I got these two caps installed on the raw water side, so that's just a piece of spare hose, and then it's a 1-inch brass slug. It's hose clamped. Same thing in the back. This was a total pain in the neck. I don't know why I thought this would be a good idea to do on the boat, but it is not. But most of the work was getting the hoses off, which I had it done anyways to remove it, but I ended up having to remove one of my fuel polisher canisters just to get this thing on. That was a pain in the neck. So, a little hard to see, but I have a 15 psi gauge on here. Now this line is from my big air compressor in my barn, and that's way too powerful for this setup, so I'm just going to bleed it with this valve and see how it does. So there's 7, and I'm going to get out my ultrasonic gear and test this. That's quite interesting, that actually very interesting that I'm not getting any pressure drop. Alright, I'm going to go turn the stereo off, heater off, get all the noise down, and then we'll see what happens. Alright, this is really tedious to film and do. I believe I've got the heat exchanger diagnosed here. Initially, I put a little pressure in here, about 7 psi, and it sat there. So we'll do that again. And you can see from that indication of the coolant, which is now overflowing out of the tank. And you can also hear it. You can hear it bubbling in there. So I'm going to pull this off. I think this thing's pooched. Bleed this in. Well, so I guess technically you can do this on the boat. It's probably a whole lot easier with way less mess to not do this on the boat. I mean, I got coolant pissing everywhere. It's a pain in the neck getting this thing on here, and now I got to do all the work anyways to take it off. So if you're thinking about doing this and you're thinking about cleaning the heat exchanger out anyways, just go ahead and yank. I mean, I've had this thing off so many times I could do this thing blindfolded, but looks like I got a cracked heat exchanger. The curse of the Westerbeke strikes again. Oh boy. The fun of removing a Westerbeke heat exchanger all came rushing back. I'm getting jaded by all this work. Anyways, pulled the two coolant lines off. I had to remove the fuel pump plate, which bolts through these little ears. And in the process of trying to unplug that, the wire broke, so I got to resplice that. Here's something that's interesting. I had put a new zinc in this heat exchanger 2 days ago. When I removed it, that's what I found. Snapped off. Amazing. I'm going to obviously have the plates off since I'm now going to remove this, and I'm going to put this in and see why. Because clearly there's some type of... I hadn't run the engine. There must be some type of physical force, mechanical force that broke that, because that was a brand new zinc. I said, just put that in. So I'm going to check with clearances to make sure it goes in there right. But anyways, heat exchanger is now off. Of course, coolant everywhere. Fortunately, it's all in my catch tank. So I'll take this off, take it outside, get some buckets, and pressurize this thing off the boat so that I can hopefully see where it's leaking from. Pull the end caps off, take a look at the tube stack. But based on what I heard, I'm buying a new heat exchanger. Alright, I'm going to try to hold this one-handed. So I've got air line with 120, but I just used that valve to bleed in, 6-7 psi. And I don't know if you can hear this, but it's definitely leaking. I can hear it. So, and it's these would be the coolant. The two open ones would be the coolant side. I've got the raw water side plugged off, but I can hear it. It's definitely leaking. So, heat exchanger effed. Okay. So here's the test setup. That's obviously the heat exchanger. These two are the coolant side, and this is the raw water side. So this is where the water comes in from the water pump, and this is where it feeds down to the cooler on the transmission. And then this would be the tank drain to drain your raw water out of the tank. And then this is a 1/4-inch NPT where your zinc would go. And I've got an interesting comment about where that zinc went. But to test it, I've just got this thing hooked up. This is a test gauge that I use for work. 1/4-inch ball valve and a 15 psi gauge with an air connect on it. So I'll hook this up. And I've got 120 psi air in here, but I'm I'm only going to put in about 10. So let's see if we can get this to bleed in a little air here. There's 10. And I can hear it leaking. I'm going to put it in the bucket. That's interesting.
One hour later.
Off. Just a word to the wise. I machined these out of some brass that I had laying around, but they're not barbed, and I accidentally bumped the valve and put more than 15 psi into this and blew one of those ports off and soaked me, and it sounded like a 12 gauge going off when that cap went off. Anyways, this would be a coolant side, and this would be the other coolant side. What was interesting though is that I had already ordered a new cooler from Lenco, who are great, by the way. They're in New York. And talked to him, made sure all the specs are right, ordered that this morning. But I said, maybe I should just test this one more time, just because I have a bucket and it's sitting here, and I never really tested it underwater. So I plugged it all off. I had taken the end caps off to show Lenco how everything worked, and I found the busted off zincs in there. So anyways, I put it all back together, just gaskets, end caps, tighten everything up, put the hose clamps back on, and put 15 psi into here and left it. And I came back an hour later and it was at 15 psi. I said, hold on a minute. How could this possibly be? I just conclusively determined that this heat exchanger was bad. And even further, the way I determined that was, first of all, when I pressure tested this on the boat, I could hear air coming out of the coolant side, and since I was pressurizing the raw water side on the boat with the coolant line still attached, that was before I took the green antifreeze, which is only on that fresh water side, was coming out of the radiator cap because I'd taken that off, and there's no other way for that to happen. And so everything led me to determine that the heat exchanger was bad. And then when I took it off the boat and tested it and heard air leaking out, I said, well, there it is, done. But seeing how it sat here for an hour holding 15 I just literally couldn't compute why that would be going on. And how could this not be leaking? And it led me down a rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, what else is wrong? And I called Lenco back, and they didn't have any ideas. Of course, he's diagnosing this over the phone. So I said, keep building the heat exchanger, but I'm going to test this thing again. So again, it was sitting there for 15 no leaks. I put it underwater in the bucket, no bubbles, nothing out of both sides. And I was just about ready to tear my hair out because I thought this was the answer. So I tapped it on the ground and then put it back underwater. You can see I've already lost the pressure. I got 120 psi in here. Be careful if you do it this way because you can do what I did and blow one of those caps off and explode in your face. Fortunately, I had sunglasses on. But I'll put 10 pounds in here. Gently. Very gently. Alright. So now that I got 10 pounds in there, and again, I had it to 15 and it sat there for an hour, but all I did was bump it on the ground. Now if I put this back underwater, now we can clearly see the bubbles coming out. So the only thing I can explain or use to explain how this is happening is that now that it's leaking, is that something must have been lodged in the hole, and by bumping it, I knocked it out of place. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad this is leaking because if I second guessed myself and put it back on the boat and it was failed, I would have felt like a moron for putting a bad heat exchanger back on the boat. But really, if you had tested this the way I had tested it, you would have said the same thing, that it's not failed, but it was. So clearly I've got a minor pinhole in here which is causing this issue, but I thought that was very interesting that I could have left this thing for an hour after telling me, or having conclusively determined that it was failed, and then second guessing myself. But anyways, just kind of a neat side note that trust your instincts, but double check everything. So there it is. That's how to test it. Just plug off some of the 2 ports with the raw water, or the raw water, test your zinc right here with a kind of a quick connect fitting here, and yeah, that's it.